In a previous video, I said this. Okay, so where does this all leave us? Well, first and foremost, we've learned that history is, well, complicated. So we know that history is complicated, but why? To answer this question, we have to dive into the history of history. The discipline of history has its own history, which explains where it came from and how it came to be what it is today. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at that history. We're going to look at how history has changed from antiquity to today. And the whole point will be to get a sense of where did academic history come from. A quick note before we begin. I used to teach an entire class on this subject. So I'm going to try to basically take that entire class and distill it down into one 15-minute video. Here goes nothing. All right, we're going to tackle the history of history by marching through time. We're going to start all the way back in antiquity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where history came from and how it sort of emerged in the pre-modern period. Then we're going to look at history, how it changed in the early modern period, and I'll tell you about when that is in a little bit. Then finally, we'll end with history in the 19th century and look at the kind of professionalization of history, or the beginning of what we might call academic history. And then history in the 20th century, how academic history changed. So it's a lot to cover, so buckle up. Okay, where did history come from? Well, at its core, history is simply an account of the past. We know that stories about the human past have existed in oral traditions throughout the world for a long, long time. Purpose of these histories were largely for kind of communal and identity formation. People told stories about ancestors, and those stories bound communities together. In some communities, oral traditions were supplemented by other record-keeping devices. In the Incan Empire, for example, storytellers were aided by quipu, knotted strings that functioned as record-keeping sort of measures. They communicated times of famines and harvests, even census data and literature like poems. Eventually, writing changed the game. Now, stories about the past could take on more solidified forms and be longer lasting and unchanging. Among the earliest writings are cuneiform in ancient Mesopotamia. These clay tablets included everything from fictional stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, to communal and political records. But here's the thing, because writing was so difficult, and because very few people could actually read and discern what was written, the subject of early histories tended to focus on what we might describe as important people and important events. Things like political leaders and military leaders and wars and changes in political dynasties, etc. I mean, if you only had one sheet of paper to record the past, what would you focus on? Well, probably those moments and people that made the biggest impact on the societies that you belong to. This is what eventually became known as great history. There are examples of this all over the world in the pre-modern period. In ancient Greece, for example, Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian Wars, wars that he himself experienced and that he deemed in his work the greatest movements yet known in history, not only of the Greeks, but of a large part of the barbarian world. In China, Sima Qian similarly wrote histories of the dynastic families of East Asia. These histories told the stories of great emperors and their families, how they came to power, and how they both exhibited political successes and failures. Again, this type of history was the result of writing being so difficult and such an exclusive activity. Similarly, we might think of this challenge as a major influence on the purpose of historical writing in the pre-modern period. History in the pre-modern period tended to focus on teaching lessons, particularly lessons to people in power. These histories had distinct morals to them, lessons to be learned from the past. The historian and scholar Liu Qiang, his biographies of exemplary women, for example, told stories of women in Chinese history, some specific and some more general or archetypal, that ended generally with some sort of moral lesson for contemporary women of his age. The idea is that these stories would serve as a guide for women to understand what they should and should not do, all within the kind of patriarchal structures of his time and place. Bede, a historian and clergyman in early medieval England, similarly wrote a history of the English people that was specifically addressed to the English king and meant for the purpose of his moral and political instruction. Bede wrote, "For if history records good things of good men, The thoughtful hearer is encouraged to imitate what is good. Or if it records evil of wicked men, the good religious listener or reader is encouraged to avoid all that is sinful and perverse. The point was that history had a function in pre-modern societies, to train elites and political leaders in how they should behave. So there you go. Thousands of years of historiography summarized in like 5 minutes. All right, in this next section, I want to tell you about what changed during the early modern period. So, what changed in the early modern period? Well, first let's define what we mean by the early modern period. The early modern period is something like the 15th through the 18th centuries, or 1400 CE to about 1800 CE. This is a rough periodization. Different historians define the early modern period differently, but for us this is going to work. So what changed during this period? Well, a few significant things. First, there was the advent of the printing press. Print had been around in China for centuries before this, but in the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg established the first European printing press, and soon thereafter, printing presses began to pop up throughout the European continent and eventually the whole rest of the world. Print did a few things to the writing of history. First, it allowed people to produce multiple copies of their histories and then distribute those copies to a much wider audience than before. No longer a challenging process, writing, right? The topics of history and the purposes of history started to broaden. Histories no longer had to be about the most important events and people for the purpose of educating political elites. It could now be about more ordinary stuff. And since histories could now become things sold on an open market, entertainment became a factor. We can trace the beginnings of popular history, for example, in many ways all the way back to the early modern period in the printing press. Finally, print also made sources more available to historians. Now, people could publish editions of sources and distribute them widely, thus making the evidence of the past more accessible to more people. The early modern period also saw the advent of significant state-building projects across the globe. Many monarchies and empires went through processes of centralization during this period. Rulers looked for ways to exert control over competing political interests and their subjects. This is why, for example, King Louis XIV of France built the Château de Versailles, a palace that exhibited his power and wealth and that served as a sort of check and restraint on competing monarchs and aristocrats. State-building projects extended all the way to history writing. Monarchs and emperors began to sponsor historians to write histories of their dynasties and their kingdoms, mostly out of an interest to project their power and their authority. They did this through new institutions like the French Academy, the Royal Society of London, the History Bureau in China, or the Office of the Imperial Historiographer in the Ottoman Empire. While this directed historical writing in very specific political ways, it also incentivized historians through access to money and resources that they previously didn't have, and thus increased the amount of history being produced. Many of these newly solidifying states also undertook the creation of what many world historians call gunpowder empires. In Asia and Africa, these empires were mostly land-based. Due to advances in navigational technology, many European empires began to stretch across oceans. These new early modern projects of colonialism had a few significant impacts on historical writing. First, colonialism brought new people into the views of historians. Europeans encountered indigenous peoples of the Americas for the first time, and likewise, indigenous Americans encountered Europeans for the first time. The histories of both societies thus began to incorporate new people into their stories, thus differentiating their histories from the kind of very communal and ancestral-based histories that predated them. Historians began to pay attention to people outside of their own societies. Second, colonial projects created permanent networks of movement across the globe. These networks transported people, both voluntarily and forcibly, as we saw in the transatlantic and global slave trades. But they also transported goods and also ideas. The result for historiography is that many historical ideas and methods began to be shared across these intellectual networks and across the globe. One of these methods was the practice of what we might call critical scholarship in the early modern period. Historians in the early modern period began to look a bit more critically at the work of historians from the pre-modern period and the sources and methods that they employed. They began to question previous histories and revise them. In this way, we might say that the early modern period saw the beginnings of what we might call revisionism, or revisionist histories. In Europe, this began in the Renaissance, an intellectual movement of the 15th and 16th centuries that was centered on sort of reviving interest and adoption of classical forms and classical sources. Renaissance humanists read and studied classical Greek and Roman texts, and in so doing, they used the tools of textual criticism to kind of evaluate those texts' veracity. The best example is Lorenzo Valla, who used his knowledge of ancient Latin, gained from reading classical texts, to critique documents that were supposedly from that era, but were in fact fake. Best example was a document called the Donation of Constantine, which Valla proved to be a forgery, and thus an illegitimate source for histories and other political claims. This kind of criticism happened elsewhere, though. In the Ottoman Empire, the first imperial historiographer, Mustafa Naima, utilized the same techniques of textual criticism to critique early Ottoman histories. In the Qing Empire in China, a movement called evidential learning, or Kaozhongshui, arose in the mid-17th century and pushed scholars in the Qing Empire to question the validity and interpretation of early Confucian texts. The result was a new school of historians who rewrote a lot of the histories of China and other places during that time. So, the point. By the end of the early modern period, the writing of history grew beyond an endeavor done by a very small handful of elites to a much broader enterprise with a broader audience, a broader base of topics, and a new set of methods. 5,000 years down, like 200 or so to go. Now let's take a look at the 19th century. The 19th century was one of the most important centuries in the history of the historical discipline. It began with what historians called the Age of Revolutions, a period starting in the 1770s and culminating in revolutions across the globe in the early to mid-decades of the 19th century. These revolutions were mostly movements aimed at eliminating and replacing entrenched political powers. This pushback on established political powers reached all the way to historical writing. In the midst and wake of these revolutions, many historians began to react against the types of official histories that early modern dynasties sponsored for a long time. Instead, they chose to write histories independent of political states. These histories focused less on the political greats, right, people like monarchs and aristocrats and generals and such, and more on the people or the nation. In this way, they kind of promoted the idea of nationalism in the early 19th century. Along the way, these newly independent historians began to discuss and formulate a method for doing historical analysis that would protect history from being co-opted by whatever political interest decided to pay for it. What they arrived upon was scientific history. The idea here was that to avoid the distortion of the past to suit sort of propagandistic or political interests, historians must have an agreed upon and standardized method for doing their work. This method, they thought, should be based on the scientific method, a method that helps ensure objectivity and veracity. The theory was that historians would first pose a question and then a hypothesis, and then they would set up experiments by way of collecting original documents and testing what they saw in those documents against each other to see if they provided information that could answer some sort of question, right? The question they asked earlier. That information was then recorded and written up into a history. That was scientific history in a nutshell. It was an important step toward making history an empirical discipline, one based on the discovery and analysis of evidence. The process was joined by a general trend toward historicism. One of the best definitions of historicism comes from the German scholar Friedrich Meinecke, who said this: Historicism is the substitution of a process of individualizing observation for a generalizing view of human forces in history. What does this mean? Well, this is just a fancy way to say that history should be the study of the particular. This was the completion of the process of divorcing history from the dynastic interests that once dominated it. By making history a study of the particular, the historian, hypothetically, avoided having to tailor history to whatever moral or political interests were pressing upon it. In other words, history could be about trying to understand the past alone, and not trying to make the past a tool for sort of contemporary political or religious fights. Historicism became the dominant way of approaching historical writing in the 19th century. Now, the guy who sort of brought all of this together was Leopold von Ranke, a German historian whose impact on the historical discipline is arguably second to none. Ranke was the proponent of the professionalization of history, a standardization of methods and manifestations and trainings and etc., so that the work of historians could be more reliable and universal and codified. So, what did he do toward the end of professionalizing history? Well, first, he contributed to the popularization of scientific history and the privileging of a particular type of historical source for historians, archival sources. You see, Ranke said that the only way to truly do scientific history was to set up one's experiments on the most reliable data, right? The most reliable test subjects possible. In other words, the original documents of the past. In the 19th century, original documents were largely compiled in state archives. This was the era in which states began to construct national and regional archives and collect official documents relevant to their national and regional histories. Ranke said that all historians must go to the archives and do archival research in order to do their work. They must use the original documents, right? The original documents and the original documents alone, and base their opinions on those sources. That was the only way to be scientific about their history. Second, Ranke adopted the historicist viewpoint. He maintained that history must be as objective as possible, and thus it had to be entirely divorced from any present interests. Ranke maintained that history must be about the past and the past alone in order for it to be trustworthy. Ranke also argued that historians needed to adopt certain conventions to assure other historians that they were following the agreed-upon rules of the profession. Among those was the use of citations, whereby historians would show readers which documents they consulted for their histories. This was to assure their readers that their studies were indeed scientific, in the way that Ranke articulated earlier. Ranke also promoted the creation of professional institutions that would help distinguish historians practicing academic history or professional history from historians that were not. This included the creation of academic journals, publications that would follow practices of peer review and only publish works that followed the type of scientific history that Ranke and others promoted, and historical associations, like, for example, the American Historical Association, which still exists today. These associations would only admit people who adopted the types of professional practices that Ranke and others supported. The process of professionalization that Ranke and historians like him pushed for was the beginning of a kind of separate enterprise of academic history, in contrast to, say, popular history or public history. Finally, to pull all of this off, Ranke said that the training of historians had to be professionalized as well. He and others began to adopt the same types of teaching techniques for history classes, including the use of and the incorporation of the research seminar, a class where students would undertake their own research and demonstrate the techniques and practices of academic history. Sound familiar? Ranke and others, like him, also helped establish the first history degree programs in universities and colleges. The degree, and particularly the PhD in history, became the key to unlocking the gates of professional history. One had to complete that course of study to be included in the types of associations that Ranke and others helped create. The overall goal was to ensure that the writing of history was the best and most accurate that it possibly could be. Professionalization meant that there were now codified standards for historians, things with which one could judge accurate history from inaccurate history. The problem, however, was that professionalization also made history a much more exclusive enterprise. Only certain people had access to the institutions that Ranke and others thought were the only ones that could train real historians. Only certain people could practice history in the way that Ranke described, accessing state archives, getting PhDs in history. Thus, only certain people qualified as real, quote-unquote, historians. And we can see what types of people were included and excluded by looking very briefly at data from the U.S. National Center for Educational Statistics on PhDs awarded in the United States. Now, this is a table of PhDs in all disciplines, but history was included in this data set. And you can see that as time went on, toward the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, more and more PhDs were awarded in American institutions of higher education. But who were they awarded to? Well, in this data set, the answer is very simple. Men. Women comprised a very small slice of the doctoral market, even smaller still of the doctoral market in history. In fact, the very first woman to receive a PhD in history and thus join the ranks of the professional historians was Kate Everest, who did so only in 1893, at the end of the 19th century. Professionalization led, in many ways, to a marginalization of certain people from the ranks of professional historian. Okay, only one more century left. Now let's take a look at what happened to academic history over the course of the last century or so. The story of professional or academic history didn't end with Ranke. While the discipline still maintains many of the norms that Ranke promoted in the late 19th century, not everything that he said went over well in the professional academic community. For example, some historians, later identified as idealist historians, criticized Ranke's claim to objectivity. Regardless of the method employed by historians, they claimed, no scholar's totally objective in her or his work. History isn't like chemistry or physics. You can't just set up a neutral scientific experiment in a laboratory. American historian Carl Becker once wrote, "The facts of history do not exist for any historian till he creates them." It's a hot take, for sure, but one with an element of truth. The facts that historians work with are only facts when historians kind of discover them or shed light on them. Scientific history, Becker and others claimed, was not objective at all. Rather, it was just the implementation of one subjectivity over another. Other historians criticized Ranke's exclusivity of sources. Yes, many historians admitted, original documents are great, but the types of original documents that Ranke paid attention to were largely political documents, memoranda, laws, and other official records collected by states and compiled in state archives. Historians like Lucien Febvre from the Annales School in France claimed that that was only scratching the surface of potential sources for historical analysis. Political documents told only political stories, but things like census data or tax records or other quantitative evidence could pull out completely different histories. The Annales school maintained interest in using original documents, but they opened the door to thinking much more creatively about what kinds of original documents could be used. The most powerful critiques of Ronchian professional history, however, came in the 1960s, as a result of the various civil rights movements that swept the globe. These movements challenged entrenched interests and authorities both politically but also culturally. Black rights and Latino rights movements fought against racial inequalities and the exclusivity of access given to certain ethnic groups and not others. Feminist movements fought against the ways that women were not granted the same rights and liberties as men. LGBTQ rights movements protested against discrimination based on sexual preference. All of these culminated in a push to dramatically expand the access of different types of people to professional historical institutions and expand the types of topics that professional historians could focus on. Ronca and the academic historians of his era largely focused on histories of political states, in large part because these were the documents that they accessed in state archives. New historians of the 60s and 70s, however, rightly claimed that these histories totally ignored large swaths of past populations. They picked up on early work by historians like W.B. Du Bois or C.L.R. James or Mary Beard and others, and began to study and write histories of communities that were largely ignored among professional historians. One example of a person who did this is Natalie Zeman Davis, one of my personal favorite historians. Davis was a historian of France, but early in her career she recognized how little history paid attention to women. At the University of Toronto, where she taught, she offered the very first research seminar focused entirely on women's history. She went on to publish books that centered women's experiences by paying attention to sources that were largely ignored by previous generations of historians. One of my favorites is The Return of Martin Guerre. It's a book that chronicles sort of stories of French peasants, not political leaders. And it really centers on one woman's experience and the wild experiences and actions that she took throughout the course of her life. It's an absolutely fascinating study, and honestly, I highly recommend reading this. But ultimately, it's an example of how the 1960s completely changed professional academic history. The end result of all of these critiques was a flourishing of many different varieties of history in the 20th century. Academic historians began to explore totally new methodologies and approaches, and thus started to write histories that were very different. Here are some of the varieties that have predominated over the past century. Political history is the study of politics and power, including not only political leaders, but also political movements and the history of state institutions. This is the type of history that Ronca wrote, but political history over the past century has developed quite a bit into lots of new approaches, and it's tackled lots of new topics as well. Social history is the history of what we might call ordinary life, or ordinary people, in other words, non-elites. This has taken lots of different forms too, from the histories of the working class that many Marxist historians in the early 20th century wrote about, to the new social histories, quote unquote, that emerged in the 1960s of particular communities like the African American community and the Latinx community and Asian American communities, Native American communities, indigenous communities, and the histories of women. Cultural history is the history of meaning, or how communities have expressed their identities and values through everything from festivals to art to language. Intellectual history is the history of ideas and how these ideas have changed throughout time. Military history is the history of conflicts and wars and how they've affected populations. Economic history is the history of money, finance, capital, wealth. Environmental history is the history of natural environments and the ways that humans have both shaped them and been shaped by them. And the list goes on. Now the historical discipline includes dozens upon dozens of subfields. These subfields all have their own professional societies, their own academic journals. Universities offer classes and seminars in them, and professional historians write books about them. All are a part of academic or professional history. So to take this home, I thought I'd show you a funny Twitter thread that I found once upon a time that illustrates the ways that the varieties of history kind of manifest themselves. Here's a thread from historian Kathleen Bellew about how different types of historians might answer the simple question, why did the chicken cross the road? Old school political history, she said, would offer a biography of what made this a great chicken. New school political history would be interested in the authority of the chicken in crossing the road and whether he was permitted, and also the state's relationship to both the chicken and the road. Social historians would want to know not about the chicken that crossed the road, but the chickens that lived in the community that gave rise to the chicken that crossed the road, such that we can better understand how the crossing was a collective action. Military historians would want to know how the road was crossed, what obstacles were encountered, and whether the chicken was successful. Intellectual historians would want to know about the idea of the road. How do we know whether it's a road? What are the boundaries the previous roads have looked like, and whether this was really crossed at all? And then other historians started chiming in. Economic historians, said Austin Clemens, would assume that chicken crossed the road as a rational choice, motivated by its desire for material gain, that is, corn pellets. Catherine French said historians of women would want to know if the chicken was female, and if crossing the road was because of her own agency or a burden imposed because of patriarchal structures. Jennifer Hilton said historians of gender would want to know about the gender constructs in chicken society. Is road crossing coded as a gender-specific activity? In crossing this road, is the chicken defying or conforming to gender norms? How might the crossing have reshaped those norms, and who benefited? Okay, it's a silly example, but it helps kind of illustrate what the varieties of history look like. This is what historians do nowadays, and this is how historians oftentimes identify what they do. They use these categories of the kind of varieties of history to talk about what type of work they do and what the impact of that work is, and the types of questions they ask, and even the types of sources that they consult. That's kind of how we got to the historical profession today. So there you go, the entire course of historiography in like 15 minutes or so. Kind of making my money today. Now, is this a complete history of the historical discipline? No. Absolutely not. You would need much longer to kind of figure out all the nuances and changes that have happened to the historical discipline since antiquity. But this is a start, and I think what I tried to do in this video is to really communicate three main things. First, the definition of history that we came up with in a previous video didn't come from nowhere. It has a story, and it's the product of centuries upon centuries of development and change, transformation, action, reaction, all of that. What that means is that history is a kind of complicated discipline by its very history, right? The reason that history is practiced in so many ways today is because it has developed over hundreds of years, and as a product of the kind of writings and work of hundreds upon thousands of people. Second, this history of history, I hope, introduced you to a few kind of key terms that I want you to have with you, or I want you to kind of bring with you throughout the rest of the course. Terms like historicism, or revisionism, or some terms of historical schools like the Annals School. As you go through research, you might see these terms come back up, and it would be useful for you to kind of know what their history is, like what their definitions are, located in the history of history. Finally, the history of history helps us understand the varieties of history today. That's really what I want you to focus on here. When we talk about kind of historiography and thinking about the history of history, what I want you to focus on is how history, over the course of its development, has sort of ended with this really complex and variegated world, whereby historians get to practice their craft in lots of different ways. Historians focus on different types of things. They use different types of methodologies. And that's all really important for you to know, because as you are becoming historians, as you're learning the craft and the trade of doing historical research, you will have to think about what types of methodologies you want to put into place, what types of history, what varieties of history you want to practice. Okay, so that's it for this video. Good job. See you in class.